Hello, welcome everyone to another episode of Dev by Design. We are so glad that you're here. We have a special guest today, my first guest actually on Dev by Design, which is wonderful and exciting. This is Vinod. Vinod, if you'll go ahead and give us a quick introduction, just who you are, what you do, where you work, anything you want us to know.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kathryn. It's great to be here. My name is Vinod. I am a product designer, or what you would call in that realm. I guess in our industry, we tend to use titles quite frivolously. I think so. You're a UX designer, you're a product designer, you're a principal designer, you are a UX UI. There's all kinds of design going on here. I mean, in fact, I've probably had all of those roles at some point in time. And more recently, I also have another, role that has been doing the rounds. So I'm a principal product designer now at a company called Beacon here in the UK. I think we'll get into talking a bit about what that role is and like what it does and so on as the show continues.
Definitely.
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And yeah, it is interesting. I like your point about titles, which do seem to be just all over the place, especially for designers. It's definitely a thing as well on the dev side. And it's interesting to see how many different ways you can say exactly the same thing. But
pretty much, yeah.
Would you say most of those have been doing the same work, or have you noticed a significant difference between a job with a title product designer versus UX designer versus principal designer or any number of your titles?
Yeah, I'm sure there's even more to come. I think it's interesting because I think we do from the industry, like we take a lot of things from engineering, right? Like design as an industry is not as mature as engineering is. So I think engineering has had longer to kind of figure out what works, what doesn't work, what titles work, what responsibility and roles and responsibility functions and so on need to be there within an organization. So design obviously is a little more new to some of these things. So I think we're still trying to figure out our ways around it. And I guess as the function evolves, and I guess what design imparts in a company changes, I think the roles that go into it also change and evolve. So when one of the first roles that I had, in fact, was a title called visual designer. So it was essentially a title that meant that you pretty much put or made things look pretty, as they would actually say it back in the day, right?
Yes.
So it meant that someone would give you something to make pretty, and then you went ahead and made it pretty, right? That's kind of like what you did. And then over time, people realize, oh, hang on, maybe we should start calling it something else. And maybe that became UI design. And then people start realizing, oh, hang on, but who does a UI designer work with? So maybe we need people who do the wireframes and so on. So, that would be a UX design role. And then over time, I think one of the things that has definitely happened is instead of companies looking for hiring specialists, I think it made a lot of sense for companies to say that we're looking for people who we can shape into who we want them to be. So I think that's really when the idea of product designer kicked in quite a bit, right? Like, so that's when people said product designer is a design generalist who could come in, and then once you're in, we can kind of understand what they want to do here, what they want to work on, what is their interest and likes and dislikes and so on. And that role became like a role that could serve a specialization within the organization that you're working for, but it was generally a broader role. And then I guess even newer roles like design operations, principal design, and so on. These are actually the way I look at it is it's a nice thing that is happening in the industry, because I think it shows that there is a seniority ranking system, or like a way where growth can be seen within an organization. Right? Like, so I think not many years ago, I think the only thing that was there within an organization to get a sense of how can I grow is by saying that you could be a junior product designer, you could be a product designer, and then you could be a senior product designer, and the next thing after that is,
Right.
yeah, you'd be like, head of design or something like that, and there was nothing in the middle. But obviously, I think I think that we actually need even more, right? Like we need even more roles to fill the gap
Yeah.
between, say, an associate to a head of a department.
That's a really good point too. That idea of like you're junior and then you're senior and then you're done? Question mark.
It's
Like you
nice,
go
right?
into management.
Exactly. It makes it look like such a dull industry, right? Like this is the only three things I can do here.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's good to have like a bit more things that you can aspire to.
Oh, we got some folks in the chat. Happy Pi Day. I didn't think about that. It is 3.14
All
Pi
right.
Day.
Yeah, nice.
Now I'm gonna need to track down some pie.
All right,
So,
excellent. Yeah, I'm hungry by that comment. Happy Pi Day
right.
indeed.
Ah, so as you kind of talked about, we will get to it. What do you do at your company, and what kind of things do you work on with Beacon?
Yeah, so Beacon is a very interesting company. So we are in the supply chain industry, or we're trying to fix supply chain from a digital products perspective. And obviously, it's an industry that has very little digital or digitalization happening right now, right? Like it's one of the most oldest industries, but there's very little that has happened to it. Things still have pen and paper and communications happening on like things like WeChat or WhatsApp and so on. So it's a very archaic industry that really needs a bit of like a jiggle, right? Like, so I think it's a great space to be in, and that's what we're trying to fix, a lot of problems in supply chain. um, what I do here, as I was saying, I am a principal product designer here, and I will say that if you ask me what does a principal product designer do, I would say we're figuring it out. So it's early days here, and yeah, I've only been here 4 months, so not a whole lot of time. But I often think of these things as an opportunity, right? Like a lot of the times when people step into a role and they think that, okay, what am I supposed to do here, and it's not very clear as to what you can do. It can be very difficult for people to find your feet sometimes, but I often look at it thinking that if there isn't that uh, list of tasks or responsibility laid out, you can actually define them, right? Like, so
Great.
so actually, interestingly, one of the things I'm doing here is to actually define what it means to be a principal product designer, and how it can shape the organization and the impact design has in many areas within the organization. So obviously, when you hear that, you think that's a pretty nice thing. You can almost say what you should be doing and not be doing. uh,
Yeah.
yeah, it is pretty good. But at the same time, I think uh, as I was saying, I think design needs a lot many more areas to grow into within an organization, internally and externally. And it could mean how many people in your company know what design means or what it does. How many people who work on the products actually know how to improve it, or make it better, or go to the right people to ask the right support, and so on, things like that. So one of the things that principal product designer does here, or we're trying to get it to being a thing here, is um, to have a support layer, right? Like, so that's one of the
Mhm.
things. So a lot of the times, many companies, including ours, we're actually going into uh, the squad formation setup. So we're defining different areas that product teams can work on and focus in. And obviously, one of the challenges of going into squads is that um, you tend to become siloed, right? Like you tend to become just interested
Yeah.
in that one area, and it often becomes difficult because two of these squads could be solving the same problem, but because they're not talking to each other,
Yeah.
um, that becomes problematic. So one of the other things that a principal designer does, or we're trying to make that a thing here, is to
What are the things you want them to do?
exactly what I should be doing here rather is definitely be that bridge, right? Be a bridge so that
Yeah.
you know what is happening in different squads, and so you can flow, be a person who can flow information between the squads, have visibility, and just offer that layer of support that squads might need at different points in time, right? Like, so for example, at a very basic level, if I have to give you like a example, let's say if you're working on a product from a design perspective, if you are at a stage where you're still figuring out your design systems, which is kind of the case here, and you might know that we definitely have the need to build a pattern library of say form components, right?
Yeah.
And let's say that we're still figuring that out, and squad 1 definitely needs it, and squad 2 might have dealt with it previously, but squad 1 doesn't really know about it. But how would we go and avoid that, right? Like, where squad 1 is trying to recreate something that has been already done before. So how do you make things visible? How do you make it easier to understand what is happening in other squads? How do you unblock people so that you're not creating more noise there, and so on? So yeah, from a design perspective, that's
It's interesting. So much of that, I think, we see the same challenges on the dev side of basically startup life, which is what it sounds like you're describing, right? Like
Mhm.
anytime you're kind of starting a new business, early days to disrupt something, you know, it's just startup culture all the way down to
Exactly.
like, we're still figuring out what this role does. We're still figuring out what we need. We're figuring out communication pathways. We're figuring out problems in the chat. Yep, always a fun challenge to try and modernize something,
Exactly.
especially like supply chain. It's got to be a strange time to be working in supply chain
It, it,
logistics
it
right
is.
now.
It's interesting. I mean, it's a fantastic time as well. So I mean, if you know
Right.
some of the things that are happening in the industry, with COVID, freight prices have like shot up to the roof. So moving goods now is actually more expensive than it has ever been in the supply
Believe
chain
it.
industry. So actually a lot of companies are looking at it as almost like this is a very interesting time. A lot of people are probably turned off because of it, but at the same time it's also an opportunity, right? Like similar to like any areas where there's a problem, there's also a solution or an opportunity waiting there. So it is as you say, a very interesting time here in this industry.
So, since not all of our viewers tend to be designers, we get kind of a mix of design and dev here, which is good. That's
Mhm.
the way I like it. But could you maybe kind of break down what an average day looks like for you in this role? Kind of what you work on, how you split up your workday, who you talk to, who you work with,
Yeah.
high level.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, there's no team is well
It's
and
never
rounded.
exactly the
Yeah, I mean,
same.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that also. And yeah, I think, and we need everyone, right? Like, I mean, a good team is a healthy mix of like people from all parties, right? Like,
Yes.
so and yeah, I mean, a day in day out for me as well involves talking to people from different functions as well as different squads. So yeah, as I was saying initially, the product designers are designers that are embedded within squads. So
Mhm.
they, product designers have a little more ownership into the design side of things. And similar to how many other companies operate, the squad does have representatives from, say, product management as well as engineering, and they form like the sort of like the three parts of like that operation within a
Okay.
squad. And there are
Yeah.
many of these squads, right? Like, so there could be a squad that is solving problems for the logistics leg of supply chain. There could be a squad
Mhm.
that is solving for the procurement need of the supply chain, and one could be solving for the analytics side of the whole operation. But on a principal level, principal designers are not really embedded within the squad. But the way I like to think about it is we are around a squad, right? Like, so
Okay.
again, what it does is, so the principal designers don't necessarily own the design work, because that would be a little sort of unforgiving, I guess, right? Like, from many perspectives, like, why do you get to own this sort of thing? So, the product designers are more closer to the products, that they own the design domain within the squad. Um,
Mhm.
but from my day in day out, a lot of my time goes into talking to the designers within the squad, but as well as talking to the engineering and product management as well, right? Because we we want to be there to give that support layer. So a lot of the times,
Mhm.
there could be a blocker that can be solved for by just understanding a product's vision perspective, and that being brought into the conversation, both across multiple squads, right? Like, so you would hear something being discussed in, say, the procurement squad, and that there's an implication of that in potentially a logistics squad. So because you're just in those conversations, sometimes you can be there to like flow information, to ask the right questions, and that sort of thing. So yes, a lot of my time is spent just in meetings. Yeah, so I would say, yeah,
Yep.
that's
That's
all.
just the way it goes. The further away you get from individual contributor, it's like inverse with how much time you spend in meetings.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's so hard, isn't it? I mean, like, especially, I mean, if you're not too long ago, you were a bit more hands-on on things. So making that shift into like being
Yeah.
a little away from that is definitely a new thing for me as well. But on the other hand, I think one of the things that I'm quite glad that there's a role for principal, is that
Yeah.
uh, principals also allow for it, for you being closer to being hands-on as well, right? Like, so I think we have like that, at least in design. I'm sure engineering has that as well, where we have that dual track sort of progression framework, where if you have been an individual contributor, the next leg up doesn't necessarily always need to be about managing people, right? Like,
Right.
so in the design side of things, the leg up could be either managing people, so you could be a design manager, but on the other hand, it could be managing the work that the people do. So that would be like
Mhm.
a principal layer. So I don't really manage people here. So I don't really, although I care about people, I'm not responsible for, like, uh,
Right, right. But you
yeah,
don't have a team of designers that report to you. You're kind
exactly,
of overarching, managing the work, managing the flow of information, helping to connect the different teams. That's
precisely.
at least what it sounds like to me for what you
Precisely,
described.
precisely. Yeah. So kind of like them, managing the work, and adding that support layer for the work that everyone are doing, but not
Mhm.
necessarily managing people, as you're saying.
I think the way you said earlier when you talked about being a bridge, that
Mm.
was really well put. And it's interesting. That's something we talk about actually a lot on Dev by Design, is this idea of trying to collaborate and trying to close that gap between design and development. Because a lot of teams, a lot of companies, I would
Mm.
maybe even say every company has struggled with it
Yeah.
at some point. Because anytime when you're taking these two groups that don't necessarily speak the same language and you're
Yeah.
trying to get them to create one finished product together, you're going to run into some bumps in the road. So I think
Absolutely.
it's really interesting that you guys have attempted to solve this problem basically by creating, it sounds like, a role that's more or less dedicated to it, to closing that gap and facilitating conversation.
Pretty much. Pretty much. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So man, that we're gonna have a good conversation today because you
Yeah.
are 100% doing what we're trying to solve. So I'm super interested to kind of get your thoughts.
Mhm.
So I guess I'd start out, when you're working. Do you work directly with developers? Do you work with engineers specifically? And when you're doing that, what kind of stuff are you working on? What problems are you trying to solve when you're pairing with them
Hmm.
specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think uh, engineering, again, as I was saying, in our squad we have uh, parties representing all three sides
Right.
of things. So uh, obviously engineering tend to be a bigger team. So in our squad, for example, we might have one product designer, would have one person
Mhm.
from the product management. They could be couldn't be a principal designer. And then we would have at least 5 or more engineering members. And then obviously we do have engineering managers as well. So there'd usually be an engineering manager who would be on say some of the initial kickoff meetings, or the initial meetings that go around understanding things from a feasibility perspective. So from an engineering perspective, that's obviously super important. Is we want to know whether what we want to build can be built or not. And one of the things that we definitely do here at Beacon, and I've always been someone to push for this, is to get all members of the party in as early as we can, right?
It makes a huge difference. Yeah,
exactly, right? Because you save a lot of time. It just, and not just that, I guess. I mean, we all know that you can have ideas from everywhere, and we very much encourage this in Beacon, is to we don't think that, and I guess it's typically true for most startups, where we don't think that there's only a function of few to do, say, the ideation and so on. So even on the design process side of things, in ideation sessions, we try to involve people from everywhere, right? Because we want more diversity of thought in those meetings. So the more perspectives you can bring into it, the easier it is for people to think of things you haven't thought about. So yeah, I mean, I think I went there on a tangent to answer your question, but
it's all good. I go on tangents constantly. Tangents more than welcome.
Right. Fair enough. But yeah, so definitely there's a lot of engineering involvement in my day-to-day work. And this is across squads, so there could be multiple squads. We're talking about whether we can do things, whether we should be investigating a particular technology that we haven't used before. If there's things from at least in the kind of products we are building, we have a lot of reliance or dependency on a lot of products that have probably been built in the Stone Age, right? So they've probably very poorly built or engineered and so on. So there's a huge dependency on understanding the technology itself. So there's a lot of early conversations in trying to unpack that side of things, and understand what we can get out of it, so that we can try to use that in the products that we're building. So there's a lot of early engineering conversations from that perspective as well.
One of the things that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was kind of that first on feasibility. So I think that's one of those things that can and often does trip up this kind of collaboration later on, right? Is that you end up with some super finished, really polished set of wireframes, or God forbid, a pixel perfect mock-up that gets handed over to a dev team, and they take one glance at it and go oh no, we can't do this.
Yeah.
So you guys approach that problem by trying to get everyone in a room right at the beginning. Is that fair to say that's the approach, or are there other things that you guys do to kind of try to crest that feasibility challenge as early as possible?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. I think I guess from a feasibility thing, I would say this almost two, but almost I'm not an engineering expert, as you can tell, so I'll keep it high level there. So the two things, I guess, from a feasibility standpoint that comes into play is, I guess, one more from how it will finally look and feel, which is more, I guess, from a front end engineering perspective. But then a lot of it, at least a bulk of things that we need to get certainty on in terms of feasibility, is actually the API layers and a lot of things that go behind the scenes, right? So a lot of the back end work is a lot more heavy for us, especially because we're a B2B company as well. So for us, I think a big part of the ultimate user experience is actually being able to trust the product more than how it actually looks and feels. So we we put a lot more stress on making sure the customer experience is great from that side, and not really so much on like how it really looks, although we do think about that as well.
I think that's all design. I think it's a lot of people that aren't necessarily designers will kind of look at it and draw that hard line, kind of be like,
Yeah.
functionality is different than how it looks. But
Yeah.
in reality, I would say there's a huge middle ground where a lot of that overlaps. So I hear what you're saying, kind of like,
Yeah.
we're not focused on the bells and whistles
Yeah.
and making, all the little tiny design tweaks, the polish at the end. But yeah, I would argue that if you're working on that flow, that user experience, like, that's all design. You need a designer in the room.
Pretty much, exactly, right. Like, yeah, I mean, so yeah, we like I said, like, the bells and whistles, we do stress on, like, it being there, and like we have
Yeah.
a great team that has the ability to think of all the wacky things that you can think of under the sun. So we're doing all of the funky things around design at the minute, and there's no where we're saying that no, this should definitely not be part of the experience. But yeah, as you can imagine, in a fast moving startup, the thing that we want to be more sure about is to make sure that customer experience uh, accounts for trusting our product more. So that definitely comes from knowing that if they're looking for a data, they should be able to find that data more. So a lot of our conversation is definitely on that dependency of pipelines and like APIs and that sort of thing. I will say though, I mean, we do have as much as we do have squads that work on solving customer problems, we are now in discussions as we speak, actually, on creating what we're thinking as guilds, right? Like, so these are kind of separate from squads, where squads are a little more as like a formalized process to say that there's a name, there's a list of people who belong to the squad, there's a particular goal, there's KPIs and all of the sort of good things around it. But a guild is more from a interest perspective, right? Like, for example, right now, because we're sort of small as well, we have a design systems, or we're trying to form a design systems guild. So this could mean that um, there could be of all the designers we have, maybe not all of them are as interested in the visual aesthetic side of things in terms of design, and of all the front end engineering. There might be some who might be a lot more closer to like building React components and so on, right? Like, so the idea of a guild is to have people who could be interested in building the things, rather than formalizing a strict process into saying what should be a delivery. So in our guild model, we are trying to address the visuals and the bells and whistles and all of that through it, and then we have like a proper squads that actually are more from like the customer experience point of view.
Yeah, I like that, the idea of like the opt-in group, to focus on things that are of interest to them and that really like get them excited. Definitely, that's neat. I'm trying not to get like too sidetracked on that and away from our design development conversation, because I'm like, that is neat, that's so cool.
Nice.
But actually, I should have asked this a little bit earlier, but is your company, are you in person right now with the pandemic? Are you remote? Have you always been remote? What's when we're talking about getting people in a room, do we mean like a literal room, or do we mean like a Zoom room?
That's a great question. I think the short answer to that is we don't know in some ways, because again, I think it's a bit hazy as to how we should be calling ourselves, whether we are hybrid as a company, are we remote first, are we remote due to pandemic, that sort of thing. So I think so Beacon had or has an office. It still has quite a big office in London. I think I would put it down as like remote first. So most people tend to work remotely, but we have a fantastic office, so people choose to come in. We have a lot of things on specific days of the week happening, organized by our culture committee and like so things like that. So there's a lot of socials to go to. So Thursday is a very busy day in office because there's a there's other things. There's a bit of I don't know if I get into any legal complications by saying, but no.
Well, now I'm very curious.
No, it's just like our kitchen just doesn't just have coffee at the end of the day. It's fair to say
I
on on,
see.
on certain days. So it definitely brings in the crowd, and it gets really busy. I wasn't sure as to why it was why Thursdays was busy, but I think it's very clear to me as to why.
That's,
Yeah.
that's great. So has that like split with like some people being in the office, but some people being remote? How do you guys tackle that kind of communication issue, frankly? Because
Yeah.
it's already pretty hard. What we're talking about is already some pretty hard problems to solve, right? It's already some like communication intensive, trying to get people in one room, trying to share expertise with knowledge topics that don't necessarily overlap. All of that is like 1 degree more difficult when you're doing it asynchronously or like over video chat. How have you guys approached that?
Absolutely, it's definitely one of the the biggest pain points is the finding ways around this, right? But I will say I think we as I guess many people around the world have kind of like adapted to it. We have definitely found ways around it, and we're still finding. So I wouldn't say we've figured it all out and we're the masters of it. So we do have occasional hiccups. We do run into ways to kind of like understand this problem better and so on. But yeah, I think we're getting there. I think. But I will say I think one of the things obviously we've been doing and we have done is invest in tools, right, like that allow to make it possible to collaborate remotely. I think we have always had things like Miro for brainstorming and like ideating and so on. That definitely
Mhm.
helps. In fact, I think our reliance on it has become so much that like I remember like a week ago we had like a boot camp of sorts where we all got together to tackle this topic around crafting our design principles. And we all got into a room together, and we were thinking whether we should have post-its on the wall to kind of like think around things. And in the end, we ended up doing things on Miro while we were all sat in the room together, right? And
Yep.
and there was many advantages to it, right? But it just means because it is on Miro, we don't have to kind of like manually have to take post-its and figure out what to do with it, and should we take photos, then put it on Miro.
Right.
So that sort of already made it better. And I think some of the things similar to that, I think remote first has made things slightly easier, right? Like because for example, you might have tech challenges. So if you have an important meeting to go to, you might just like have a buffer time between before the meeting, so that you allow for certain things to go wrong before a meeting. So
Yes.
that takes care of it. Things like we've one of the things that I had in one of my previous roles was this idea of operationalizing design. So similar to that, we're obviously having things like when you go into a meeting, have agendas to it, and you have action items and so on. So that meetings can be a little more streamlined as well. Oftentimes, if you're in office, maybe that can go into many different parallel side tracks. So we can quite easily avoid that while you're collaborating remotely. And we use Google Meets here at Beacon.
Mhm.
One of the raising your hand functionality on Meet
Yep.
also makes it a little easier to kind of know who wants to say something when, right? So in a meeting room, obviously, you'd probably do a bit of like body language, sort of understanding who might want to say, or the person with the loudest voice usually gets to say what they want to say,
That's so true.
right? But you can
Yeah.
avoid all of those sort of things because this technology kind of like helps to solve for it. So yeah, I mean, so that's one of the things we've been doing here, is to invest in tools that allow you um, to collaborate remotely better. But then the other thing, I will give a huge shout out to our people team here at Beacon as well, because I think they have been amazing at organizing activities remotely, as well as getting together people on different occasions, so that despite being async or despite being remote, there is still a sense of belongingness, right? Like, so I think that's hugely important, and it can easily feel like you're completely cut out or disconnected from your colleagues. So I think from a people perspective, that's also equally important. So I think we're doing things around that as well.
I've got two questions that I've been holding on to, and I'm trying to decide which one, because I think they'll split us off in like very different conversation tracks.
Uh-huh.
But I think I'm going to go with, earlier you said something, you were talking about operationalizing design, and I was so curious about that. It was such a, I've never heard that term before, and I'm very interested in what that approach is and what that involves.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, this itself is like a topic in itself, right? I think, yeah, it's. I think it's so there is actually a role for addressing that in many companies. And I think it's been doing the rounds for some time now. It's
I
probably.
feel out of the loop. I'm so curious.
Yeah, I think you'd call it design ops or design operations
Okay.
in many places. It sometimes can have a bad rep as well, because I think people thought that it's like a funky, cool title that will like go out of the window. So that sort of thing. It's just like it sounds cool, but it actually doesn't do much, sort of thing. But I think the genesis, if you will, of that role definitely comes about from many companies experiencing hyper growth, right? So a lot of startups. Yeah, I mean, if I have to go back in time, in one of my earlier roles, I worked for a design-centered agency back in Bangalore, in India, where I am from, and I worked there for a little over 4 years. And when I started, we were like a little, maybe 40-ish. And 4 years later, we had grown out to be a little over 100 or so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, these days, I think you can get to that scale like in matter of weeks, right? Like it won't be like 4 years or so. So now when I actually think about, like, it took us 4 years to get to that, is quite decent. But now I think you can get to literally hyper growth in matter of no time, right? Like, because you get a huge influx of money with funding and so on, and then you just know that you can solve a lot of problems faster by just throwing people to the problem, right? Like, so if you can.
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes, yes, completely,
Sometimes.
completely agree. I've been in other roles as well, where we've been in some companies where we had too much money, and we've always thought that it can
Right.
always be where you can solve problem with people. And as you're hinting, it it doesn't always go well, right? Because then you just like have you know problems occurring due to hiring quicker, and then you hire more people to fix those problems, and then you hire people to fix the problem of the people who were trying to fix the problem. It spirals out of control, really, isn't it?
Yeah. But anyway, I didn't mean to throw you off track. Carry on.
No. So I think similar to that, like, from a design standpoint, it's the same thing, right? Like, it's kind of like making or making sure that as companies experience hypergrowth, scaling is a little more meaningful, right? It's not so that you just hire people because you want to build products faster. It's because
Right.
you are trying to solve the right problem, and you're scaling sort of organically, right? So I used to always refer to it in that role, and like similar to many of the things I do here is my focus area used to be these 3 Ps. So one is around the product, one is around the process, and one is around the people, right?
That's really
And
nice.
yeah, and as you would do it, I think the thing is that if you want to operationalize it, one of the things you do want to do is to optimize or make things better as well. So it used to always be, in those 3 areas, right? Like, so how do you make the product better? How do you make the process better? And I won't say that how do you make people better, but you get around like,
How
how
do you
do you
help the
make,
people grow? Yeah, no,
yeah,
I get you.
yeah, exactly. How do you make
Support
people,
the people.
exactly, exactly that. Yes. How do you support people? How do you make sure, people know what they can do when they want to do things? How do they reach out to the right people? How do you be the person who can kind of like, at times be that bridge, as you were saying as well? So that sort of thing. So those should be like, the three areas. But yeah, I mean, a lot of that used to also come down to like, from the product perspective in that piece could also mean a design systems, right? Like, so a design
Mhm.
operations person could be involved in the design system side of things. So that's also to operationalize design so that you can scale design and the touch points it has more
Mhm.
effectively.
I like that. I like that as a term. That was a new one to me, and I'm tucking that away. Design
Look,
ops. Um,
nice.
the other thing that I'm
Mhm.
looping way back,
Yeah, yeah,
you talked a little bit about Miro. You talked a little bit
yeah.
about like Google Meets.
Mhm.
I'm curious what kind of tools you guys use either to tackle the remote problem or just in general. That's one of the big questions that we tend to get here is like, what do you do your design work in? Do you use Figma? Do you use Sketch? Do you use XD?
Yeah,
Whatever. And are there
yeah.
other tools that kind of support your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we are Figma here as a primary tool. Um, I will say, just before I had started, I know that we had made that shift, the huge shift, as many companies might be going through, or like
Yeah.
not to say that anything. I've loved Sketch, and there's a lot of great things about it as well. But yeah, I mean, again, it's just a scaling thing, so it made sense for us to move into Figma for that reason, and so we had gone through that process just before I had joined. So that is definitely the primary tool of choice here for design. Um, the peripheral around it is obviously all the support tools that we need for it. So we have obviously invested, like the rest of the world, into the Atlassian ecosystem as well, which
Yes.
is uh, which again, like it I don't know, maybe it's grown to that stage where there are many problems associated with that affiliation with
Yeah.
with
I think
right.
everyone on earth has like a love-hate relationship with Jira.
Yeah. What do you think, Catherine? Do you feel the same on like?
Ooh, I it seems bad to be like, I like Jira, but I do kind of like Jira. I've
Right.
mostly because I've tried some alternatives and I
Yeah.
don't like them better. So there's
Yeah.
a quote about, I believe it's actually about like democracy, where it's like,
uh,
it's not the answer, but it's the best thing we've got right now. Like it's not.
yeah.
I think Jira is kind of in the same boat where like, is it perfect? No, but
Yeah.
it's the best tool we've got for this at the time.
Right.
So uh, that's
Yeah.
that's my hot take on Jira.
That's a good way to look at it, actually. I mean, I think I do suspect a lot of people at Atlassian might know about this, right? That might,
Yeah,
like, they might think of it as there's no other alternative of sorts. Although, yeah, I mean, a lot of the times, yeah.
that
I-
all shifts so fast. I was
oh
just
yeah,
thinking because
definitely.
like, yeah, I don't think we talked about this, but I actually started my career in design and
Hmm,
shifted over into engineering. And it
right,
was long ago enough that the Adobe suite was still the be all end all
right.
for all kinds of design. And when I was going through college and in the few years right after that, when I was doing like 100% design focused work, it
Yeah,
was Creative Suite or bust. And we thought that was going to be the be all end all forever. And that
yeah.
has been so displaced now.
That's completely true, isn't it? I mean, like, yeah, but even I think that's a great example, as have many other design tools also, right?
Yeah,
Like, you can see them come and go. So yeah, I mean, it's true. It's very easy and in fact, that's actually how startups do come about, right? Like, to find a gap and trying to
right.
fix that gap. So yeah, I mean, like, a lot of the times, like, we also think, like, maybe the ecosystem is a little too feature rich for our needs. Maybe you want to scale back, have something simpler.
Yeah,
And one of the other things for us, at least from a member of the design committee, or from that representation, is that a lot of, like, Jira doesn't represent design very well.
no,
um,
it's very engineering focused.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And that's a huge problem for us, right? Like a lot of the times,
Yeah.
like it probably has always been engineering centered tool, but then how do you bring in design work into it, right? Like, does it mean that we have to write our tasks better to match up the engineering requirement? Does it mean that
Right.
product needs to write stories better so that stories are around a problem and not about a solution? Or is it about like having yet another tool to kind of like bridge the gap there? So we do have a lot of problems around that. In fact, this is,
Interesting.
yeah, it's quite topical because we're actually trying to figure this out right now here at Beacon. So
I was gonna ask, like, how have you solved that, or have you not yet? Sounds like not yet. So you
yeah,
guys are just design is going into Jira for the time being, and you're just kind of
yeah.
looking for
Uh,
something better.
yeah, kind of. I mean, we're trying to obviously make it also. I as I probably hinted, was like trying to change. I mean, we're trying to get open the conversation, right? We don't want it to just say that this is what designers think, or this is what engineers think, and hence it should be like so. This is what product manager thinks, and this is how it should be. We want to get like a little. We want to approach it a little more holistically. So we want to get if we do change anything about it, how does it impact engineering? How does it impact product
Yeah,
management? And how does it impact our customers? And so all of those sort of perspectives we want to bring into that conversation, right? Because and this ongoing conversation around having our design principles and talking about our design process, they also kind of like bring that support layer in, knowing if we are
right.
if we are approaching the process of doing work and the tools that allow us to do the work the right way, right? Like they need to be in like that close sort of harmony there. So yeah, I mean, short answer to your question, we haven't figured it out, but we're in the works, I guess.
That's fair. So if anybody's listening and you're looking for a new startup or a side project idea, some kind of task management system, they can bridge the design development gap.
There you go.
No,
There you
it's a small, quick, easy to solve weekend side project, I'm sure.
I'm sure. And then
Yeah.
maybe Atlassian will come to eat your lunch then soon.
Yeah, right.
Right. Perhaps.
So
They,
on that note, kind of talking about the process and the like, I guess I'm trying to think of the right word, that I can't come up with a better one than process of moving designs through and over into development. I think a
Mhm,
lot of times there's kind of, we talk about like the handoff or whatever,
mhm,
right? When it's
mhm, mhm,
often the first time a designer or a developer is seeing a designer's fully
mhm.
finished work. So you might have had that like kickoff conversation, everyone got aligned, and then you kind of split for a minute. Design works on something, come back together, and it goes, oh, like this is
Mhm.
what you got.
Yeah.
I found that there can be some friction at that point.
Be bad.
Um,
Yeah.
it can be bad,
Yeah.
um, especially around developers trying to offer feedback
Mm.
to design pieces. I was curious if you kind of had any tips for developers that want to give effective feedback on designs, on prototypes or mock-ups or
Mm.
wireframes, whatever comes back to you at that handoff point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's an interesting one as well, actually, because it's also very topical, as you can imagine. Like this, we're talking about all of these things at this minute right now at Beacon. So we have been talking about design reviews and that sort of thing, right? Like which kind of allows for uh, a mechanism to capture feedback. And one of the things we were talking about, which is sort of like a thing that we agree on, and is show often and show early, right? So
Yes.
that just makes it easy, so that you don't want to show things too late, because obviously there's problems with that.
Yeah.
And if you don't show it at all, then there's obviously a big problem with that as well. So but I mean, if you show it often and you show it early, then you're capturing feedback before it is too late to address it. And that's the whole point. And we were talking about doing this not just at a squad level, but having meetings for everyone to input on this, right? Like so at a squad level, obviously then you get that perspective from engineering. You could have product management, and all perspectives being brought up. But one of the things we think is also important is that a lot of the times you could be solving a problem, and if it doesn't align with the business's objective of your startup, that can also be a problem, right? Like, so you want to have meetings that capture reviews from, say, business perspective also early and often. So we're trying to work that in also into our review meetings. And the other thing to it, so we have what you would call, meeting rituals, right? Like, so some of
Yeah.
these rituals are to address those problems, right? Like, you have a ritual for doing a design review, or you have a ritual for doing a design retrospective or a product retrospective. You could also have a ritual to do a design or a product showcasing. So,
Yeah.
so you can almost think of, you could have a sprint kickoff. You could have, like, some sort of like design review. You could have meetings to do retrospective to see how a sprint went, and then after you've done what you've built, you could have like a showcase to show what you've done, right? Like, that sort of thing. So I don't know if I have any specific tips I can think of, like from an engineering perspective, um, to, to pass on feedback. But I think one of the things that is valuable is to not hold it back, right? Like, a lot of the
Yes.
because a lot of the times I feel like, you know people might think that, oh, is this the right sort of feedback, or like, is this me doing the work for the designer? And a lot of the times I've seen engineering holding it back, but then when you give them a bit of like a push, then they kind of like, are like very open to telling you all the ideas that they had. And it feels like, I personally think, I mean, no, I mean, some might get offended, some might not, but I mean, it should be okay for everyone to
Yeah.
chip in their ideas, even if you think that, maybe that is what a designer does. That's okay, right? Like, I mean, if a
Yeah.
designer is capable of doing that and they didn't do it, maybe there is something to tell them that they-
Right. There might just be a perspective you have that they don't, or something that they weren't aware of. So,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And yeah, I mean, I completely believe in this, like, the outsider thinking perspective, right? Like, a lot of the times,
Right.
because you're too close to the problem, you get married to the problem, right? When you get married
Right.
to it, then you just you have that sort of like, the Stockholm syndrome sort of thing, right? Like, you just you empathize with
Yes.
the problem, and then you feel that, this isn't this how it should be. But then suddenly you have an outsider perspective, and then you're like, oh wow, I didn't think about that, right? Like, and so that can be super super useful. So I mean, I would encourage everyone to share what you have to say, even if you think it is like, telling the designer, or telling or designing it, for that matter. I think it should be okay to kind of like, put that across, because it additionally adds that perspective, as you were saying. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that concern about like offending someone or hurting feelings is one that I've seen a lot, and I always want to be like, no, it's okay. Like they can take it. Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
always used to joke with people like, there's nothing that you can say to me about this design that will be meaner than what my art professors told me. Like you cannot hurt my feelings any
Yeah.
more than they did.
Exactly. There
They
you go. Yeah, I mean, you've had a perspective on both sides of the party, so you know how it is,
Right.
right? Like, yeah.
There's no way you're meaner than them, so have at it. Like,
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
all right, well, we are closing in on the end of our hour, our time. I wanted to
Mhm.
ask you one more question, and
Mhm.
then chat if there's any questions you wanted to ask. Now's the time, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. So to close on, is there anything that you wish that developers knew about working with designers? Like if you could give them like one tip, what's your
Mhm.
golden ticket? Like, please do this, don't do that.
That's an interesting one. Okay. I think, yeah, I just similar to, the conversation we were just having, is I think we're probably not as sensitive as we 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 get a reputation for, right? Like, I think it's okay. I think we can take it, right? Because I think,
Yeah.
um, I definitely think, the industry has done a great job at, I guess, processifying things, right? Because not many years ago, when you just said the word design, it just felt like, this is like a very fuzzy little thing that I don't know what it is about, right? Like, so if you needed a design, you just hope that I'll go to a designer and tell them what they need, what needs to happen, and then magically, they'll go into their hiding hole, or like, they'll go carve a bit of like earth and hide for like, a few weeks, and magically come out with like a design, right? Like that's what
Yeah.
people used to think, right, happens with design. But I think like over the many years, one of the things the industry has definitely worked hard on is to make processes more predictable, right? Like, so we have
Mhm.
things like, design thinking from, one of the things that IDEO had originally conceptualized. And then, every company have their own sort of design processes. You can have like, all of these sort of ways of making design predictable. So because of which, I think people are a little less sensitive about like, their ideas, or like, their
Mhm.
solution, because people used to be, I guess, many years ago. But now that people know that, it is not about your great idea or your big solution, it is more about solving the customer's problem with a solution, right? Like, so I think people are okay to take criticism, right? Because we have even processified the idea of it. So
Right.
so I think that's my single thing to say, is that be okay to reach out and have a conversation around it. And I think that's something I would encourage everyone to do.
I think that's a really good suggestion. And I think it is interesting. We've talked a lot about that kind of process today and design ops and kind of that shift. It has been interesting to watch design still as mirror engineering in terms of process and structure.
Hmm.
I feel like that's something that we've seen happen more recently, and in some ways that's been really good. I think some of that process has helped like, demystify design and take some of that feeling of like magic or whatever out of it, because it's
Yeah.
made the process more visible. It's created more like check-in points and touch points.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, I think there's a little bit of I wonder sometimes if we got the opportunity to make a design process in a complete void, which is maybe silly because design doesn't live in a void, but
Hmm.
yeah, if it wasn't mirrored to the
Hmm.
engineering process, I wonder what it would look like. So maybe
Hmm.
a void is not correct. Maybe if it didn't always have to be in lockstep with an engineering team. I don't know
Hmm.
what that would look like. I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. It's,
But
it's good wonderment, right? Like, good thing to think about. Yeah, it's quite nice.
yeah, I'll leave all of our viewers with that one today. Chew on that for a week, friends.
Nice one. Good note to end it on. Awesome.
But,
If you do have
but
answers, then yeah,
yeah,
do let know.
let us know for
Yeah.
sure. But
Awesome.
yeah, thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Having
All right.
fantastic conversation. I am so
Awesome.
glad. I agree. This was really cool. I'm so glad that you joined us. I feel like we touched on a lot. People
Awesome.
in the
Yeah.
chat were enjoying it too. Um,
Amazing. I
if
enjoy.
people, oh, go
Sorry.
ahead.
Sorry. I was just
uh,
going to say I enjoyed it thoroughly as well, and it's been, yeah, great talking to you, Kathryn. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
I'm so glad. If people are interested in following you or seeing some of your work, where can they find you?
I have one domain which kind of hopefully links it all. If I have paid my bills, it should still show up on your browser. So it's milk, but it's milk with a Y. So it's MYLK.in.
Awesome. I will throw that in the chat. See if your work or maybe reaching out to you or whatever. I always like to leave that just in case people have follow-up questions or just want to see what you do. But all right, thank you
Absolutely.
guys so much for watching. This has been Dev by Design. We are here every Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, talking through fundamentals of design and design for developers. This was our first episode with a guest, and I was so glad to do it. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we'll see you later.